June 16th, 1945, northern Luzon, Philippines. The rain hitting the palm leaves sounded like slow-motion gunfire. But it wasn't the rain that terrified Aiko. It was the silence. The silence of 200 women kneeling in the mud, waiting for a shout, the rack of a bolt, or anything that signaled the end. Aiko didn't tremble. She wouldn't allow herself to. Her right hand was buried deep in the pocket of her tattered nurse's uniform. Her fingers white-knuckled around a cold, jagged object. A rusted scalpel. It was her last possession, and her final passport. Inside her head, a single number was counting down. 10, 9, 8. She remembered the commanding officer's words before he pulled the pin on his grenade 3 days ago. Do not let the white devils touch you. Death is the only purity left. 7, 6. Aiko flicked her eyes to the side. Haru, the 18-year-old assistant nurse, was biting her lips so hard blood was trickling down her chin. Haru didn't have a knife. Aiko had promised to help Haru go before the American soldiers could defile her. Aiko tightened her grip on the handle. The dull blade sliced shallowly into her own palm, a sharp, grounding pain. The roar of engines tore through the curtain of rain. Olive drab trucks loomed out of the heavy mist, massive and aggressive, like iron beasts. They ground to a halt. Aiko held her breath. This was it. She eased her hand slightly out of her pocket, the blade glinting beneath the fabric. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the heavy thud of jackboots, the barbaric screaming, the tearing of clothes she had heard described 100 times in the propaganda sessions. But there was nothing. Only the creak of a door opening, heavy but leisurely footsteps, and voices. Not the snarls of animals, but low, lazy murmurs in a thick language she couldn't understand. Aiko opened her eyes. The Americans were jumping down from the trucks. They were giants. That was the first thing that struck her. Taller than any man she had ever seen in Japan. Colossal figures in mud-caked uniforms, yet bursting with vitality. They didn't look like men who had been starving or desperate. They moved around the prisoners with a strange, terrifying lethargy. One American soldier walked right past Aiko. She flinched, her thumb pressing into the flat of the blade, ready to lunge, cut Haru's artery, and then her own. But the soldier didn't even look at her. He stepped past her as if she were a rock or a tree stump by the road. He turned to say something to his squad mate, and then he laughed. A wide, open laugh that showed a row of perfect white teeth. Aiko froze. This indifference was more terrifying than brutality. Why weren't they attacking? Why weren't they dragging the young women out of the line? Were they waiting for orders? Or did they have a crueler game in mind? A cold thought raced down her spine. They are waiting to gather us all. A mass grave. Yes, that had to be it. Americans were famous for their efficiency. Why waste bullets on individuals when you can solve the problem all at once? From the back of the truck, another group of soldiers began unloading large metal containers. Aiko squinted through the rain. Dark green boxes, heavy and industrial. They lined them up precisely in front of the kneeling prisoners. Is it gas? Haru whispered, her voice cracking with terror. Aiko didn't answer. She stared at the boxes. If it was gas, she had to act now. She couldn't let Haru die, choking in agony. An American sergeant, a man with a thick mustache and eyes hollowed out by lack of sleep, stepped up to the first box. He signaled to his men. 2 soldiers stepped forward and popped the latches. Clack, clack. The sound of metal on metal rang out dryly in the jungle. The lid was thrown back. A cloud of white steam rose up. Aiko held her breath, bracing for the sting of mustard gas or chlorine. But the smell that hit her wasn't chemical. It was rich, heavy, fatty. The smell of animal flesh being scorched over fire, but seasoned in a way that was alien to her. The smell of beef tallow, the smell of charcoal, the smell of abundance. Aiko's stomach, shriveled after 3 weeks of eating tree roots and drinking stream water, suddenly spasmed. A violent cramp twisted her gut, not from fear, but from a primitive biological reflex she thought she had forgotten. Hunger. The sergeant reached into the steam. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out small, wax paper bundles, droplets of condensation clinging to the wrappers. He took one, tearing the paper open. Inside was a round, brown mass sandwiched between two halves of a soft bun. Aiko had never seen anything like it. Back home, bread was rare, and beef was a luxury. Here, in the middle of a war zone, it looked like an artifact from another planet. The sergeant looked around at the bewildered women. He seemed to recognize the absolute confusion in their eyes. Or maybe he was just hungry. He lifted the mass to his mouth and took a huge bite. Sauce dripped onto his chin. He wiped it away with a hairy backhand, chewing aggressively and swallowing hard. Then he grabbed a cardboard carton filled with those same paper bundles and walked straight toward Aiko. Aiko went rigid. He was coming for her. In her mind, two trains of thought collided with violent force. On one side, survival instinct was screaming as the scent of meat hit her. It woke up every dying cell in her body. It promised life. It promised heat. On the other side was the sharp, cold voice of honor. This is the mercy meal, the meal for the condemned. To eat from the enemy is to sell your soul. And then a more practical fear crept in. Poison. Why would they feed prisoners this precious food? It must be poisoned. A slow-acting toxin to kill them without wasting ammo, without getting their hands dirty. The Americans wanted them to die full, die in ignorance. The sergeant stopped in front of Aiko. He held out a steaming bundle. His blue eyes looked straight at her. No hatred, no lust, just an infinite exhaustion. The fatigue of a man who just wanted to finish his shift and go home. Eat, he said. Or Aiko guessed that's what the chin jerk meant. Aiko looked down at the paper. The heat radiating from it hit her mud-streaked face. Her left hand drifted up slowly, trembling. Not because she wanted to take it, but because her body was betraying her will. But her right hand still gripped the scalpel in her pocket. She had to choose. Right now, take this, eat it, and become a pet of the enemy waiting for slaughter. Or pull the knife, drive it into this giant's jugular, and die like a warrior of the Emperor. Haru nudged her shoulder. The girl was staring at the bun in the sergeant's hand, her eyes glazed over with starvation. Aiko-san, Haru wheezed. It smells so good. Haru's voice was a bucket of ice water on Aiko's fever. If she attacked now, the GIs would open fire. Haru would die. They would all die. Aiko slowly withdrew her right hand from her pocket, but she didn't drop the knife. She skillfully slid it up into her loose sleeve. Pressing the cold metal against the inside of her wrist, she reached out with both hands, cupping them to receive the bundle. Heavy. It was heavier than she expected, and hot. The heat pierced the wax paper, soaking into her freezing palms, racing up her arms, thawing veins that had been constricted for days. The sergeant nodded. then moved to the next woman. He distributed the bundles with mechanical efficiency, like an assembly line worker. Aiko sat there, holding the mass of food like it was a grenade, with the bin pulled. She slowly peeled back the paper. The scent exploded. A thick, seared patty of ground meat resting on soft white bread. Hidden underneath were pickles and dark red ketchup. It looked crude, naked, and materialistic. It had none of the refined beauty of Japanese cuisine. It was a brick of brute energy. Aiko looked around. A few women had started eating. They were weeping as they chewed. One woman was retching, her stomach unable to handle the shock of protein. Others ate furtively, eyes darting around as if afraid it would be snatched away. Aiko lifted the bun to her nose. The smell of beef fat made her dizzy. If it's poison, how long will it take to die? She wondered. Maybe dying by poison is less painful than cutting my own throat. She opened her mouth. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She took a small bite. Her taste buds, deadened by weeks of bitter roots, were suddenly assaulted. Salt, the sweetness of the meat, the sharp tang of the pickle, and above all, the greasy coating sensation of animal fat melting on her tongue. It was terrifyingly delicious. And because it was delicious, Aiko felt a wave of humiliation rise from her chest. Tears sprang to her eyes. She was eating the enemy's food. She was enjoying it. She was betraying every Japanese soldier who had starved to death in these jungles. She wanted to spit it out, but her throat swallowed automatically. Her stomach roared in gratitude, welcoming the food like a savior. Aiko chewed, tears dripping onto the wax paper. She cried silently. She felt filthy. Just then, a strange sound hissed beside her. Hissed. Aiko jerked her head around. The sergeant was back. He wasn't holding the box of burgers anymore. He was holding a wooden crate filled with oddly shaped glass bottles containing a black bubbling liquid. He had just used a metal tool to pop the cap off a bottle for Haru. Gas and foam surged from the neck of the bottle, fizzing like acid. Careful! Aiko screamed inside her head, about to slap the bottle away. That black water was surely poison. No one drank black water, but Haru had already taken it. She sniffed it, wrinkling her nose as the bubbles popped against her skin, then curiously tipped it into her mouth. Haru coughed violently. Her eyes went wide. Sweet, Haru gasped, her voice in disbelief. It's sweet, Aiko-san, and it dances in my mouth. Aiko stared at Haru, then at the sergeant. He was holding another bottle, tilting his head back to drain it in one long pull. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down. He let out a loud belch, not bothering to cover his mouth, and exhaled a sigh of satisfaction. No one died. No one fell over convulsing. There was only the sound of wet chewing, the sound of swallowing, and the hiss of soda gas. Aiko's arm slowly lowered. The scalpel in her sleeve slid down, slipping out of her cuff, and plunged point first into the soft mud beneath her knees. It sank without a sound, disappearing into the murky puddle. She looked down at where the knife had vanished, then back at the half-eaten hamburger in her hand. Why? The question drilled into Aiko's mind, more painful than any wound. Why feed us? Why not kill us? If they aren't the devils the propaganda promised, then what are we? And all those deaths out there, the soldiers who disemboweled themselves to save their honor from these monsters, what did they die for? A shiver racked Aiko's body, not from the cold, but from a new kind of horror. The horror of the meaninglessness of this war, just beginning to ignite inside her. That night, for the first time in months, Aiko slept, not the fitful sleep of the hunted, but the heavy, comatose sleep of a full belly. But the real torture hadn't even begun. Sunlight hit Aiko's eyelids, harsh, unforgiving. Her eyes snapped open, her body tensed instantly, waiting for the pain, waiting for the cold dampness of a dungeon or the searing heat of hell. But she was lying on a cot, a canvas cot, raised off the mud. There was a blanket over her legs, thick, scratchy wool that smelled of mothballs and warehouse dust. She sat up, gasping. She checked her hands. They were clean. The mud had dried and flaked off, but there was no blood, no shackles. She looked around. The tent was bathed in morning light. Haru was sleeping on the cot next to her, breathing rhythmically, a line of dried drool on her cheek. Aiko felt a wave of nausea. I'm alive. The thought wasn't a relief. It was an accusation. She had eaten the enemy's meat. She had drunk their black sugar water. And because of that, she had slept through the night while the spirits of the fallen watched from the jungle edge. She stood up, her legs wobbly. She walked to the flap of the tent and pushed it aside. The camp was bustling, but it wasn't a prison camp. It looked more like a factory. Trucks were being unloaded. Men were shouting orders about crate numbers and fuel supplies. There were no execution squads, no torture racks. Instead, there were clipboards. Aiko watched as a young American corporal sat at a folding table near the entrance, typing on a portable typewriter. Clack, clack, ding. He wasn't guarding demons. He was processing inventory. Aiko walked out. No one pointed a gun at her. A passing soldier nodded. Just a quick, indifferent tip of the chin, and kept walking. That nod broke something inside her that torture never could have. If they had beaten her, she would have been a martyr. If they had raped her, she would have been a victim. But they were ignoring her. To them, she wasn't a warrior of the empire. She was just a displaced person, a logistical headache, a mouth to feed until the ships arrived. Line up, an interpreter shouted in broken Japanese. The women shuffled into lines. It was time for medical processing. Aiko found herself standing before a doctor with thick glasses and hairy forearms. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her arm, grabbing it with a grip that was firm but clinical. He swabbed her skin with alcohol. The smell, sharp, sterile, chemical, hit Aiko's memory like a hammer. It was the smell of the field hospital where she had amputated gangrenous limbs without anesthetic. But here, under the bright sun, it felt obscene. The doctor stuck a needle in, a vaccination. Then he dusted her hair with white powder, DDT, to kill lice. He treated her exactly as a farmer would treat livestock before transport. Efficient, hygienic, completely devoid of hate or love. Next, he grunted. Aiko stumbled forward, rubbing her arm. She looked at Haru, who was being dusted with powder. Haru was giggling, because the powder tickled. Aiko wanted to scream. Don't you remember? She wanted to shake Haru. Don't you remember the lieutenant who blew his own head off? Don't you remember the oath? But Haru wasn't thinking about the oath. Haru was thinking about breakfast. And breakfast came. It wasn't hamburgers this time. It was powdered eggs and canned peaches. Yellow and orange. Bright, artificial colors. Aiko sat at the long wooden table. The women around her were talking now. The silence of the jungle was gone, replaced by the chatter of survival. They compared the taste of the peaches. They marveled at the softness of the bread. Aiko ate mechanically. Every swallow was a betrayal. She realized then that the Americans had a weapon far deadlier than the atomic bomb. They had normalcy. They didn't defeat you by destroying your body. They defeated you by making your sacrifice look stupid, by showing you that while you were eating roots and preparing to die for honor, they were eating burgers and worrying about paperwork. The dissonance was unbearable. Aiko looked at the hamburger wrapper from last night, which someone had smoothed out and left on the table. A piece of wax paper, grease stains. That was what her honor was worth. A greasy piece of paper. Days turned into weeks. The weeks bled into a routine that was terrifyingly comfortable. Aiko worked in the laundry tent. She washed American uniforms. The fabric was thick, high quality. She scrubbed the mud off the clothes of the men who had killed her brothers, and she felt safe. That was the worst part. The safety, the predictable rhythm of 3 meals a day, the bugle calls, the movie screenings on Saturday nights where the prisoners were allowed to sit at the back. She saw Mickey Mouse. She saw newsreels of American cities, skyscrapers, cars, women in nylons. She realized she had been fighting a war against the future, and the future had won, not with a sword, but with a hamburger. One afternoon, the interpreter told them the war was over. Japan had surrendered. The women cheered. Some cried tears of joy. Aiko sat on her cot and stared at her hands. The scalpel was gone, buried in the mud of Luzon. She couldn't kill herself now. It was too late. She had been fed. She had been cured of lice. She had been processed. She was going to live. She was condemned to live. Flash forward. Tokyo, 1985. The neon lights of Shinjuku were blinding. The noise of the city was a deafening roar of electronic music, traffic, and voices. Aiko, now an old woman with a back bent by time, walked slowly down the crowded street. She stopped in front of a brightly lit glass window. Inside, young Japanese couples sat at plastic tables. They were laughing. They were dressed in fashionable Western clothes. And they were eating. They held the round buns with both hands. They bit into the meat. They drank dark, fizzing liquid from paper cups with red straws. Aiko watched them through the glass. To them, it was just lunch. It was fast, cheap, and convenient. But to Aiko, the smell wafting out of the ventilation duct, that mix of frying grease and seared beef, was the scent of a graveyard. She closed her eyes, and for a second, the neon lights vanished. She was back in the rain. She felt the heavy, warm weight of the wax paper in her freezing hands. She saw the sergeant's tired blue eyes. She felt the cold steel of the scalpel sliding away from her wrist. She remembered the taste of that first bite, the taste of surrender. A young man bumped into her as he exited the restaurant. "Sumimasen, Oba-san." "Sorry, Grandma," he said cheerfully, holding the door open. He had a burger wrapper crumpled in his fist. Aiko looked at the wrapper. It was identical to the one in the jungle 40 years ago. "It's okay," she whispered. The boy ran off to catch a train, throwing the wrapper into a trash can without a second thought. Aiko stood there for a long time. History books would say the war ended on the deck of the USS Missouri. But Aiko knew the truth. The war didn't end with a treaty. It ended the moment she chose to eat. It ended when the hunger for life overpowered the hunger for honor. The Americans hadn't just brought food to the jungle. They had brought a question, wrapped in wax paper, that Aiko had spent 40 years trying to answer. Was I saved, or was I bought? She turned away from the window, pulling her coat tighter against the wind. The taste of grease lingered in the back of her throat, a phantom flavor that would never truly go away. She walked into the crowd, disappearing into the modern Japan that was built on the ruins of her silence.